I changed the ball links from clevises at all the control surfaces because I think they're more secure. All of the control rods felt like they had a little hard spot to me. I put the smooth end in my cordless drill and used the threaded end as a gentle ream to run it in and out of the holes to kind of open them up a little bit, and this seemed to reduce a lot of the friction. Here I'm using silver solder to secure one of the clevises on the smooth end of the control rods. It takes a little while for my soldering gun to generate enough heat, but it does, and we get a good joint. I had a major league wide open crash with silver soldered controls like this, and none of those came apart. It's a little more time consuming, but silver solder makes for a great joint. When mounting the EME 60, I found that my 2.5-inch standoffs were just right for this airplane. Getting the standoffs right is critical. You get a good relationship between the cowl and the spinner. And you can see that I went with a Dave Brown spinner because the one that Top Flite gives you, the cone screws onto the base plate, and I just don't like that. It will work, but I had the option for the Dave Brown, so I took that. I used the flexible control rod that Top Flite includes because it made a decent throttle linkage. Top Flite included this nice Dubro 32-ounce tank with the kit. But if you've been following me for any length of time, you know that I'm addicted to the rotor flow tanks, so that's what's in this one. This is a 24-ounce rotor flow tank that's all plumbed and ready to go in. The plate that the tank is attached to is designed by Top Flite to make installing the tank easier. I always use the 3-line option where I have one line that goes right to the carburetor, one that goes for the filling, and one for the vent, and they're all separate. The rotor flow tanks come with that middle port sealed, yet you have to drill that open if you want to use the 3-line system. I don't fool around when I secure my gas tanks because I want them to stay where I put them. Nothing good ever happens from a tank that's moving around inside the airplane. I left the lines a little long so it'd make it easier to fish them through the fuselage while I'm installing the tank. The narrowness of even a giant scale P51 fuselage makes this a little more of a task than you might think. But I did get the tank in and everything's seated properly. A pair of hardwood blocks are installed at the factory, and we can secure the tank tray to those. I used a 1/16" drill bit to drill pilot holes. It just makes it a little easier. I can't get in there to drill a nice square pilot hole, but put a screw in both of these holes and this fuel tank isn't going anywhere. And I do use my servo screws for this also. I use them for all kinds of stuff in an airplane. I usually run them in a ways with my power gun and then use a hand tool to finish tightening them up so I don't crack or split anything. Top Flite includes a couple of plates that we have to epoxy to the wing where the bolts go through to reinforce that area. And this is where I found out they had the covering down so good I couldn't get the color part of the covering off. I'll dig out some coarse paper and sand this area before we epoxy the plates on. After those plates are installed, we have to epoxy the bottom scoop on. I use my long set epoxy to put that scoop on and this front fairing piece. And this was the end of day one for this segment of the build. I'll let this epoxy set up overnight. The whole time I spent cutting the fake exhaust out, I kept thinking that these just didn't look very good. Later I'd find out that these are actually longer than the side of the cowl. I decided to leave them off, and I'll keep my eyes open for another set of fake pipes for this plane that looks better. The inside of the fuse is getting a little crowded now that I've got all the servos in place. I'm going to wait to clean up the wiring until after we balance this plane so I know for sure where the batteries are going to wind up. There are a few places in here to tie them down, so I'm hoping one of those will work out for the CG. Yes, my civilian pilot is too small and he's too far forward. But I'm building this plane in memory of my father, who from the time he first saw him in World War II just loved the P51s. He was a tank driver and not very tall, so he'd understand the joke about the short pilot closer to the pedals. The instructions say to just C8 his wing fairings to the side of the fuselage, and I did that, but I added these screws because I just know one of these fairings is going to fly off while I'm flying the airplane. This is a cheap, simple bit of security. I plan on putting retracts in this plane at some point, but a bunch of you wanted to see the stock gear installed, so we're going to use them for the initial flights. Top Flite includes all the parts and the wheels that you need, and these should be direct replacements for when I go to the retracts. The last thing we want on a tail dragger is some badly aligned main wheels. Get too much toe in or toe out and it acts like brakes and you can flip this thing over on the nose and start breaking expensive props. Hold a straight edge up to the axles and you can see if they're parallel or not. You can turn the fixed mounts just a little bit before you tighten the screws, and that's usually enough to fix any errors you find here. Take the time to grind some flats for the set screws on the wheel collars. If a wheel falls off, this wire will not skid on the grass. It's going to dig in and wreck your airplane. We're not looking for anything pretty, just a couple of flat areas to let the set screws get a good hold. No matter how I make those flats, I take a fine file and just lightly go over the edges just to make sure that there's no raw edge sticking up from the grinding or filing operations, because those can really wear out a set of plastic hubs quickly. Install the doors that cover the mounts on the fixed gear, and we're all set to go. When we're ready to go to retracts, you should be able to just unscrew all of this stuff and drop the retracts right in. This is the fixed tail wheel, and I decided to use this rather than go to a retract here. A tail wheel retract is about $200 all on its own, and a lot of you can't afford that, and neither can I. We're going to go with the fixed wheel on this plane and see how that goes. The only problem with installing the fixed tail wheel was working to get the pull cable set up underneath this block that the wing mounts to. That just forces you to work at an odd angle. It gets a little frustrating, but we got it done. Next up, we got to balance the plane, and then we're about ready to take it out and see if it'll fly. So watch for segment 3.